Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture on labor economics. In this lecture we are going to talk about the labor market in particular. It is a particularly important market when it comes to analyzing income inequalities and other outcomes such as economic growth. First, disclaimer. I do not allow this content to be published without my consent. If I see it online, I will take it down and I will report whoever posted it. Employment is a good indicator of economic growth. In fact, very often we see those two indicators go hand in hand together. Economic growth fosters job creation and reduces unemployment, and there is a feedback effect where more jobs increase production. That also increases income in general, which tends to increase demand, and in turn it increases economic growth. Labor income is tightly related to consumption and hence economic growth. So the situation on the labor market directly affects income inequalities. It will then be particularly important to look at equity on labor markets as opposed to only efficiency as we would look other commodity markets. Before getting into any model of labor supply, I want to talk a bit about measuring income inequalities. We use two different indicators. The first one is the top 1% share, or more generally the top X% share, which represents the percentage of all the income earned in an economy that goes to the 1% of earners who have the highest earnings. If you want to measure it, imagine you have a data set, an Excel spreadsheet, and you order all the incomes of all the individuals in increasing order. Then you look for the income level such that only 1% of the population makes more than that amount. Then you compute the total earnings of those earners and you divide it by the total earnings of all earners. The top X% share being Y% means that Y% of all income went to X% of the people. If that number goes up, typically it means that the rich are getting richer, because the X% richest people have an increasing share of the total income. However, it does not mean that the poor are getting poorer. If you want to look at the poor getting poorer, then you can look at the bottom X% being equal to Y% of the total income. The rich could be getting richer because maybe in the middle of the distribution, some of the income was shifted towards the richest. But maybe the X% poorest people did not see their share of income decrease. So the top X% share could increase for other reasons as well. Turns out that the rich are getting richer could just be due to maybe the share of other parts decreasing, but not really their share, not really their income per se increasing. They could have a higher share because overall there is a lower amount of earnings as well. So you should carefully look at these measures and look at also what happens at other parts of the distribution. Income is not only related to labor income. There are different sources of income. For instance, somebody who owns a property and rents it to his tenants is going to perceive another form of income, rental income. If somebody invests on financial markets or anything like this, then there could be another source of income. So when it comes to labor income in particular, we might want to use another measure, and this measure helps measuring wage inequalities. This measure is the logarithm of the 90th wage percentile and the 10th wage percentile. This is what we call the ln 90 to 10 ratio. So, first of all, find W90, which is the wage, such that 90% of earners make less than that wage and 10% make more. Then look for W10, the wage such that 10% of the population makes less than this wage and 90% makes more. Finally, compute the log of the ratio. So you can do the same computation as before. Order observations by wage, by annual wage. Look for the wage such that 90% of the people make less and 10% make more. This is the top X percent, the richest, the highest earners. Look for W10 such that 10% of the population makes less. So those are the 10 poorest earners. And then take the ratio and then take the log. It is a measure of the percentage gap between these two wages. So it measures the distance between workers at the top and workers at the bottom of the distribution. If this gap increases, then wage inequality increases. The distance between W10 and W90 widens. Remember that on each side of these wages, we always have 10% of the population. We have the 10% richest and the 10% poorest. In the middle, we have 80% of the population. So if this gap increases, either because W90 increases or because maybe W10 decreases, it means that we have more inequalities, because on either side of these wages, we always have the same amount of people. Now, let me talk about labor as a commodity. In order to analyze labor supply, we are going to define labor as another good, a service that agents can sell to firms. So their time is a service that they can sell to firms in exchange for a wage. So first, I need to remind you of the definition of opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of choosing an alternative is the value of the next best alternative that was given up. We always measure the opportunity cost of making a decision. The cost in terms of opportunity of that decision is the next best opportunity I just gave up on. I talk about this because leisure can be seen as a good. An hour of fun comes at a price. This price is an opportunity price. This is the wage the agent gave up by not working. So the wage in this sense is the opportunity cost of leisure. If today I decide to take an hour off, I decide to leave an hour early, I am giving up on a full hour of wage. If this is my next best alternative, then this is what it cost me to go home earlier or to quit work earlier. So one can look at labor supply as the result of maximizing utility subject to a budget constraint. Part of the budget constraint is going to include the wage, which is going to constitute labor income, which can be used for consumption purposes. Working means making money to consume, and this way we can increase our utility. But working is not fun. So working decreases utility. Fun, on the other hand, or leisure, increases utility, but it does not earn money. So you can see how now we are facing a trade-off. On one hand, I can not work, have fun, but I don't have much money to consume. On the other hand, I could work. It is annoying, but it earns the money I need to fund my consumption. So there's a trade-off. And people in general have some sort of a balance. They work a certain amount of hours, which is fine to them, depending on their consumption needs. Other people don't work at all. Those are the ones who in general cannot consume a lot, but if that maximizes their utility, so be it. And you have the ones who work almost all the time, can consume a lot, but have no time for leisure. The workaholics, kind of. So now let's get into a model for labor supply. This is a neoclassical ECON 201 type model. There have been many more models around labor supply that have been created since then. We will just stick to the standard one to get some intuition about what's going on. Consider a consumer who has utility over the consumption of a composite good C and leisure L measured in hours. There's a maximum of T hours that can be used for leisure, which leisure is denoted by L, or work T minus L. You can think of T as being the total amount of hours a consumer has during a day. For instance, if we count 8 hours for sleeping and 16 hours for either working or fun time, then T would be equal to 16. What is not used for leisure is assumed to be used for work here. Utility then depends on consumption and leisure. Utility increases in both of these commodities. Our consumer wants to maximize her utility subject to the following budget constraint. Budget constraints always follow the same format. What is spent must be equal to what is earned, or must be lower or equal to what is earned. Here, money can be spent for consumption. So on the left-hand side, we have the expenditure, P times C, where P is the price of consumption. And these expenditure must be equal to what is earned. Here we have two components. Component I is a non-labor income, such as rental income, financial income, or any sort of income, lottery income, pocket money from your parents, plus your labor income, W, the wage, times the amount of hours worked, T minus L. Now our consumer will try to maximize his utility subject to this budget constraint. I can represent leisure and consumption on a diagram, and this way I can represent indifference curves. Remember, an indifference curve represents all the combinations of the two goods, consumption and leisure, that yield the exact same utility to the agent. So this point here, 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 and so on, yield the exact same utility. Indifference curve then cannot touch each other because each indifference curve represents a different level of utility. The higher the indifference curve, in the sense the more northeast it goes, the higher the utility. So the utility of this indifference curve is higher than the utility of this indifference curve. The budget line is in red. It represents all the affordable bundles that the consumer has access to. Note that if our agent works 0 hours and decides to spend all of his time on leisure, big T, then his consumption is equal to his non-labor income, I, over the price of consumption. Since the agent doesn't work, he doesn't perceive any labor income at this point. On the other hand, if the agent decides to work all the time so that leisure is equal to 0, then the agent will be able to afford a consumption level equal to non-labor income I plus wage times all the hours worked, all the hours that are available in a day, divided by the price of consumption. Note that the slope of this budget line is going to be the wage rate divided by P, the ratio of prices. W is the price of leisure, P is the price of consumption. Any point below the budget line is an affordable combination of consumption and leisure. Any point above is not affordable to the consumer. Working this much and consuming this much is not possible. Our agent will not have enough money to afford that bundle. Then, the consumer is constrained to stay within the boundaries of this set, all the affordable bundles. He's going to look for the highest possible indifference curve such that it stays within the boundaries. The highest indifference curve here is located at the tangency point between the budget line and the indifference curve. Here, the indifference curve touches the budget line at only one point, and any indifference curve above this one would be unaffordable. Any indifference curve below would be affordable, but we can do higher here. L star C star will be the optimal bundle of the agent, where his amount of leisure is equal to L star, this length here. And the amount is going to work will be the complement, T minus L star, here. And C star will be the level of consumption. Now, an important concept to understand if we want to look at labor supply and in particular labor force participation is the reservation wage. The reservation wage is the lowest wage at which someone is willing to work. It is at which labor supply becomes positive. In consumer theory, the reservation price is the highest price a consumer is willing to pay for a good. The reservation wage is the minimum wage he is willing to work for. This wage will determine labor force participation. It is specific to each individual, and it will determine whether that individual will prefer to work or not. If the market wage is not higher than the agent's reservation wage, then the agent's indifference curve is not necessarily tangent to the budget line. The idea is that if the market wage is too low for an agent, then he is not willing to work. So, his indifference curve will not be tangent to the budget line, but rather will touch the budget line where leisure is equal to big T. In this case, our agent spends all of his time having fun, doesn't work, so no labor force participation. Welfare policies can have an impact on the reservation wage and have adverse effects on employment. We will go over some of these welfare policies in a bit. In fact, there is some kind of a mistake here. welfare policies don't have an impact on the reservation wage. The reservation wage is specific to everybody's preferences. The welfare policies, however, will have an impact on the shape of the budget lines. So, different welfare policies can lead to different budget lines, which in some cases can lead to a tangency point, and other cases not. For instance, here we have a case of an individual whose indifference curves are pretty steep, pretty vertical. That means that leisure is very appreciated by the consumer as opposed to consumption. The idea is that the agent needs to give up on a lot of consumption when he increases his leisure by a tiny bit. Because he values leisure a lot, his indifference curve is not tangent to the budget line anywhere. Rather, the only place where it touches the budget line is at the corner. But here, tangency is not necessary. The highest possible indifference curve of our agent is then located at a point where leisure is equal to big T, no work at all. So it is interesting to look at different types of people, different types of preferences, to see if some policies will have an impact on their labor force participation. First of all, do they want to work? And second, how much do they want to work? This is the distinction between the extensive margin, yes or no, work or not, and the intensive margin, now that I work, how much do I want to work? I want to go over some welfare policies implemented to influence employment and in particular labor force participation. I will go over two simple examples. The first one is called welfare, where an income Y minimum, is given to those who don't work. For each dollar earned at work, welfare is reduced by $1 until reaching the amount of work L minimum that allows the worker to have an income Y min. No money received beyond that amount of work. So imagine that the amount of welfare Y min is equal to $1,000. If you don't work, you receive $1,000. If you decide to work, let's say per month, if you decide to work 1 hour, paid at $10 an hour, you work 1 hour over the whole month. Then the government is going to give you $1,000, but since you also made $10 from work, the government is going to take back $10. At the end of the day, you will end up with $1,000 again. So whether you work or not, your income will stay at $1,000 until you work enough to make more than this amount. The second policy I will be talking about is negative income tax. The initial payment is the same, Y min, but for every dollar that is made on an hour of work, the government doesn't take the full amount back, but rather claws some of it back. So on each dollar made, the government takes C cents back. Once at L minimum, once the worker is working enough to make $1,000, the government doesn't pay any benefits anymore. Let's look at the first policy. We are going to face different kinds of individuals, different indifference curves. Some individuals that worked before are still better off working and not receiving welfare. Those are the ones where the indifference curve is sufficiently high, and even though their budget line is affected at the bottom if they barely work, the indifference curve by working is already higher than all the other possible indifference curves. Then those people will not receive welfare and will not decide to change their optimal amount of hours worked. So no change on these people. The interesting people are the ones that worked before, but now might be able to reach a higher utility by stopping work and receiving welfare. So these ones were working, but now they withdraw from the labor force. It is what we call a poverty trap. A typical example of a poverty trap is the case where single parents are better off not working and taking care of their children under welfare than working and having to pay for childcare, plus related expenses like commuting to drop off their child and pick them up, and so on and so forth. Somebody could be making $2,000 a month working and having their kid at childcare, but once welfare is implemented, they might realize that they might be saving money by staying at home, taking care of their children, so not paying for childcare, and making $1,000 from welfare benefits. It is a trap in the sense that these people are better off not working, although they were working before. Finally, those who were not working before still won't work. They were not working before and they were not receiving any money for it. Now they receive money from the government regardless of whether they work or not. So they will still not work. The overall effect is either a no change or a reduction in labor supply. The ones who are already working enough prefer what they have. The ones who were not working before are still not working, so no change regarding those two types of individuals. But some of them who were working before now might prefer not working. Moreover, it is an expensive program. The government has to fund all these individuals and pay them. So not only it is an expensive program, but it does not increase labor supply whatsoever. Nobody has an incentive to start working now. What about a negative income tax? Individuals who work but still receive the benefits, they receive Y min, but they earn 1 minus C on any extra dollar. So instead of giving the full amount back to the government only takes C% back. Now we're going to distinguish 4 different cases. Among those who did not work before, some still don't want to. The first hour of work still doesn't pay enough. Their own reservation wage is too high. If they make $10 per hour, the government will take $5 back if the clawback rate is 50%. So their net wage will be $5 an hour. If it is not enough, then they will still not work. There are some others, though, that might get an incentive to start working, because now the income earned is Y min plus 1 minus C times the amount of hours worked times the wage. This is the wage they would be making if there was no clawback, but they only get 1 minus C% of this money. C% are going to the government. This could be higher than the reservation wage, and so they might decide to start working. Now, among those who work already, we also distinguish two cases. The same as before, we have the ones who worked enough to not get benefits before, and their indifference curve is higher even with the prospects of getting some welfare benefits. Those ones are not affected by the policy, so their labor decision is not going to change after the implementation of a negative income tax. There are some, however, that now might decide to work less to receive a positive benefit. Imagine somebody making $1,200, so not needing any welfare. Now, with negative income tax system, this person might decide to work less to earn $900 plus the government benefits. So that person is going to reduce her working hours. The net effect is ambiguous here. We have two types of people who are not going to change the decision: the ones who don't work and still don't want to, and the ones who work enough so they won't make any adjustment in their hours. But then we have two other types of people who are going to react in opposite direction. One type will work less to enjoy the benefits and enjoy not working as much, whereas others might find it beneficial to start working. To assess the overall impact, one would need to conduct an econometric analysis. Empirical analysis supports that many people behave like in the fourth case, which makes this program expensive and overall would have a negative impact on employment. There are many other welfare programs. One of them is called the Self-Sufficiency Project. It is something I will talk about in the tutorials. Any questions about welfare policies? All right. Now, I want to talk about various things around the labor market, such as payroll taxes, regulation measures, statutory benefits. I'll talk about labor market discrimination as well, and so on. Wages are subject to payroll taxes. Payroll taxes are paid by both the employee and the employer, so they can influence labor demand as much as labor market. Since a wage represents a cost to a firm, paying a payroll tax on top of it will reduce labor demand. Payroll taxes, however, fund the provision of benefits like unemployment insurance, health insurance, retirement pensions, and so on. Statutory benefits are non-wage benefits that workers are entitled to by law. They usually influence labor supply in a positive way. If there are many benefits to a specific job, chances are labor supply for this kind of position will be high. Statutory benefits, among other things, include weeks of paid time not working. In Canada, I believe it is 4 weeks for everybody. At least 4 weeks. Then I want to talk about limiting the number of hours to work for a full-time job. France in particular adopted such a measure, I believe, in 1999 or 1998 by decreasing the amount of hours per week of a full contract from 39 hours a week to 35 hours a week. The objective of this policy was to increase employment, because now firms would have to hire extra workers to make up for this reduction in the hours worked by their employees. Turns out the effect was actually, or maybe is actually not so good. One of the reasons is that it increased job uncertainty. Firms, instead of hiring more full-time workers, proposed part-time or limited-term contracts. Those are very uncertain types of contracts that can prevent workers from getting a loan from a bank, for instance. Moreover, workers are very well protected in France, thanks to the work of unions over the years. This means that people who have a full-time contract are in general well treated, but that also means that it is difficult to fire an employee. Because of that, firms are more reticent at the idea of hiring full-time positions. Rather, they prefer to have part-time or limited-term contracts, which are more flexible, to avoid hiring somebody full-time that they might want to lay off later. What about a minimum wage and the universal basic income? A minimum wage sounds like a good idea. It can ensure decent income earned, but it reduces labor demand. Remember that the wage is a cost for the firm. If now firms have to pay the employees more than before, then they might not want to hire extra workers. So the minimum wage has a dual effect. Insiders are better off. Workers that already have a full-time contract are better off because now they're getting paid more. However, it is harder for non-employed workers to find a job, so outsiders are worse off. There is a vast literature around the effect of minimum wage on labor market outcomes. Some studies have found an increase in labor demand, in employment in general. Others have found an increase in a decrease in employment, and other studies have found no effect. The consensus estimate for Canada is that a 10% increase in the minimum wage will result in a 1 to 3% reduction in employment of low-wage workers. So, all of the employees who are not losing their job after a 10% increase in minimum wage will be better off. But the ones who got laid off as a result will be made worse off. Have you heard of the universal basic income? It has been a very hot topic in the last 5 to 10 years. It is a basic living stipend guaranteed to all without any condition. The argument is that it could help fight poverty and the associated medical costs. It might also be relevant in our age where many jobs are replaced by automation. There might not be enough jobs for everybody once all of these jobs are replaced by automation. So, the universal basic income could be a way to guarantee some standard of living for the ones who cannot get a job. However, it's been criticized. It is costly because it requires a high amount of money to distribute over the population. It is not necessary incentive compatible. If you know you get some amount of money for sure every month, why would you work? You might want to work to get some extra money. But if it pays you enough, you might prefer to stay out of the labor force. It remains in a trial period. I believe countries like Finland and Norway have started some pilot programs, but many questions are still unanswered. How much is enough to have decent standard of living? How much is too much? After all, it is costly. How to fund it? Some have talked about reducing the generosity of the universal healthcare system and use all the money that is saved on these expenses to fund the universal basic income. In this case, people would have to contribute to their own health insurance more. It is an interesting concept. Things are rapidly changing, many jobs are being replaced, so there is definitely a certain share of the population that might not have access to a job in the future. Now, I talked about a specific type of individuals, in particular, those who have a specific type of job. In reality, labor is not a homogeneous good. In general, we distinguish two different characteristics so that it gives us 4 different combinations of jobs. We distinguish routine and non-routine jobs, the ones that are very repetitive versus the ones which are not. And then we distinguish manual versus cognitive jobs. You can make 4 possible combinations: routine cognitive, routine manual, non-routine manual, non-routine cognitive. The evolution of information and communication technology influences jobs differently. It has negatively influenced routine, manual, and cognitive jobs because they can be replaced by machines and sophisticated algorithms. For instance, assembly line workers or clerical work. Those are jobs which might not exist in the next 50 years. But it can also complement some other jobs, like non-routine cognitive jobs. Scientists, managers, doctors, teachers. Technology helped my job a lot. It increases my productivity, my ability to produce more and better content. And it even allows me to teach you guys remotely. 20 years ago, everybody was using a blackboard and a piece of chalk. On the other hand, it doesn't affect non-routine manual jobs, although now we can discuss that statement. Janitors are not very likely to be replaced because they have to go from room to room and so on and so forth. Those are not things that computers can do on their own necessarily. Drivers, however, could be replaced by self-driving cars. Waiters, in some parts of the world, I believe in some restaurants in Tokyo and maybe in Seoul in South Korea, already have some robots that do part of the waiter's job. They come to your table with an iPad and you can directly input your order. Of course, then you still need waiters to bring the food to your table. But some restaurants also have conveyor belts and other things like that. Now, I want to quickly talk about labor market discrimination, which we define as a situation in which persons who provide labor market services and who are equally productive are treated unequally in a way that is related to an observable characteristic such as race, ethnicity, gender, and so on. A couple of stats which might be slightly outdated now by maybe a couple years. On average, women in Canada earn 75 to 80% as much as men. This gap is about 64% for women age 55 plus. So older women earn even less than their male counterpart. For women under 24 years old, this gap is lower, but it still exists. There is also discrimination across ethnicities. African American men earn about 80% as much as Americans of European ancestry. In Canada, we also have such a statistic regarding Aboriginals, First Nations, Métis, and Inuits. In Canada, Aboriginal men earn about 11% less than men of European ancestry. Now, while the statistics are alarming, one needs to understand that, first of all, things have been improving over time. Maybe not rapidly enough, but they have been steadily improving. And the second is that we also need to look at the type of jobs that each gender or each ethnicity tends to occupy, and look within those occupations if there is a gender gap. For instance, there are more men in the army than women. There are more men having positions such as firemen, security guards, and so on. And there are more women in occupations such as social workers, healthcare, and so on. So if you want to look at the gender gap, you will have to look at within each occupation and compare the wages across genders or ethnicities. We distinguish two theories of discrimination. The first one is taste-based discrimination. This is the type of discrimination we would like to avoid, we would like to erase. Discrimination occurs when employers have preferences for hiring certain types of workers. It also can come from customers who have preferences for who they buy from. Or it could be co-workers who have a preference regarding who they work with. This is the type of discrimination which is purely due to taste. This is the one we would like to avoid because this is the type of discrimination which is unfair and unethical. It's pretty much face discrimination. The other type of discrimination is called statistical discrimination, which occurs when there is imperfect information on the ability or the productivity of workers, especially at the time of the hire. So, productivity is different across workers. So, it is random. Employers do not observe productivity before hiring somebody. They observe, however, a noisy signal of productivity through the resume, through job interviews, for instance. And they use this signal to assess the ability of the applicants. Education is used as a signal of one's productivity. On one hand, firms can use resumes to assess the level of the applicant. Oh, this one went to college, this one didn't. Maybe one has more abilities than the other. Maybe he has more skills. Or one of them went to this university, another one went to that university. That university is more famous. Their graduates in general are on average more successful or maybe smarter. So I'm going to value such an applicant over somebody who went to another less famous university. Employers will think something like, oh, he went to Harvard, he must be smart. I'm willing to hire him, and maybe to pay him more than somebody with the same degree from a different university. And applicants can also use this as a tool in the wage bargaining process. If they know that going to Harvard is being valued by employers, they're going to use that line on their resume to bargain for a higher wage. The idea is that their opportunity cost of taking this job is high. If they went to Harvard, there are many other firms who would be willing to hire them for a higher wage. So that gives them an advantage during the bargaining process. There are a lot of things in this lecture. I talked about very different topics and not a lot in details. It is a fascinating field of economics. I encourage you to look at it, especially because you will also be concerned once you graduate and once you get to start working. In the meantime, that's it for this lecture on labor economics. Have a good rest of your week, and see you in the next one. Bye.